Back then, the United States that we know today did not yet exist. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in the vast land called the New World, there were only long coastlines, deep forests, wide rivers, and a chain of 13 small colonies scattered along the shore. From the 17th century to the 18th century, groups of Europeans, mainly the English, alongside the Dutch, French, Germans, and Scandinavians, crossed the sea to come here. They left behind crowded cities, exhausted fields in Europe, heavy taxes, religious wars, and the oppression of kings and lords to seek a new opportunity. The journey across the ocean was nothing romantic like in fairy tales. The wooden ships were cramped, damp, full of disease, with huge waves and sudden storms that could drag everything to the bottom of the sea. Many people did not live to see the distant shore. But those who did arrive saw a completely different world, endless forests that had never been logged, rivers rich with fish, fields that could become farms, and small towns beginning to appear. Each colony was born with different purposes. Some were founded by merchants who wanted to profit from trade, others as a refuge for people escaping religious persecution. Like the Puritans in New England, some colonies relied on agriculture, growing tobacco, cotton, and wheat. Others developed commerce, shipbuilding, and fishing. Villages and towns were formed from simple wooden houses, small churches, schools, markets, and taverns where people drank home, brewed beer, and argued over public affairs. Even though they were separated from England by an entire ocean, all these colonies in name were still under the authority of the English king and Parliament. The governors of the colonies were mostly appointed by the king or the English government. The system of laws, taxes, and trade were all bound by decisions made by people in London. For a long time, that control did not yet cause a major storm because the colonies were still small. The people were busy surviving, clearing land, and England itself applied a relatively loose style of rule, allowing the colonies to handle many internal matters on their own. However, history is always moving. In the mid-18th century, the British Empire became entangled in costly wars, especially the conflict with France in North America, which people often call the French and Indian War in the New World. The war ended, Britain won and gained more territory, but at the same time carried a huge debt. The government in London began to look at the colonies with different eyes. They now appeared as a source of money to fill the deficit. From there, new tax laws were issued one after another. People in the 13 colonies had to pay stamp tax, tax on documents, tax on imported goods, tax on tea, and more. Worse, they realized a clear injustice. These taxes were decided by the British Parliament, but they themselves, the people living in the colonies, did not have a single representative in that parliament. They were subjects of the king, forced to obey the law and pay taxes, but they had no voice in making the laws. From a quiet dissatisfaction, a bitter question began to echo in the minds of many people. How could that be called fairness? Gradually, in taverns, coffee houses, small hand-printed newspapers, and community meetings, people repeated a slogan: no taxation without representation, meaning no taxes without representation. That short slogan was like a sharp knife, cutting into the core of the problem. The colonists were not yet saying they wanted to rebel, but they demanded something clear. If they had to pay taxes, they must have a voice in the institution that decided those taxes. The reaction of the ruling classes in London was not gentle. Instead of listening and adjusting, they believed the colonies were too far away and that the people there were only subordinates who needed to be taught a lesson. New laws continued to be launched. Sometimes they repealed an old law, but at the same time issued another, more subtle one, in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and many other places. Waves of boycotts against British goods began to spread. People sometimes burned goods, sometimes silently turned their backs on products imported from the mother country. Tension thickened day by day. In Boston, a busy port city in the colony of Massachusetts, clashes between British soldiers and colonists occurred frequently. Once, a skirmish turned into bloodshed, and several colonists were shot dead. People called it the Boston Massacre, and journalists and orators used this event to inflame public anger. In that context, the next major fuse was the story of tea. The British imposed a tax on tea imported into the colonies. While tea was a familiar daily drink, to protest, On a cold winter night at the end of 1773, a group of colonists in Boston disguised themselves as Native Americans and quietly boarded ships of the British East India Company moored in the harbor. They did not burn the ships or kill anyone. They chose to throw all the chests of tea into the sea. The chests plunged into the water, broke apart, and the tea leaves floated on the surface. It was a highly symbolic image. The colonists were casting away the impositions and the contempt they felt from the mother country. This event went down in history as the Boston Tea Party. For the British authorities, that act was like a slap in the face. They responded with harsh punitive laws, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was blockaded, trade came to a standstill, and the local economy was strangled. Instead of making the colonists fearful, these punishments caused other colonies to feel both anger and sympathy for Massachusetts. For the first time, people in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the southern and middle colonies began to see that their fate was tied to the fate of Boston, that if Britain could punish Boston today, it could do the same to them tomorrow. A political turning point took place. The colonies sent delegates to meet together, forming the First Continental Congress in 1774. They discussed and debated how to respond to British policy. At this time, most still did not dare to think of completely separating from Britain. They only wanted to claim fair rights within the empire. But the wheel of history had already begun to turn faster. In April 1775, in the small towns of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, the steady footsteps of British soldiers sounded on the dirt road. They were ordered to move in to seize weapons and arrest some colonial leaders. Local militia, farmers, craftsmen, and shopkeepers took up their old rifles and stood waiting. No one knows from which side the first shot was fired, but that shot opened a war that would last nearly 8 years. What had previously been only political conflict and street clashes now became a real war between the army of one of the mightiest empires in the world and the local militias of the colonies. News of Lexington and Concord spread like wildfire. Not long after, smoke covered Bunker Hill, a hill near Boston. There, the colonial forces, though eventually driven back and forced to retreat, inflicted heavy losses on the British. Both sides realized that this war would be neither easy nor short. In that situation, the Second Continental Congress was convened. They had to make a decision. Should they continue only demanding reforms within the empire, or take a further step beyond the point of no return? Amid long debates, one figure emerged as a symbol of unity. That was George Washington, a tall and calm Virginian who had previously served in the war against France and enjoyed respect in many colonies. The Congress chose him as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. This was an important step because it showed that the colonies were no longer just separate groups of local rioters, but were beginning to think as one common entity, a country in the making. Alongside military preparations, an intellectual revolution was also unfolding. Pamphlets, essays, and speeches about liberty, human rights, and the right of people to govern themselves were written, printed, and passed hand to hand. Among them, the most famous was a small booklet called Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Using simple and direct language, Paine asked why a vast continent like America should be ruled by a small island like Britain. Why should people who live here and are born on this land forever depend on a distant court across the ocean? These ideas were like the drops of water that overflowed the cup, convincing more and more people that the only path was complete independence. By 1776, the air was ripe. Debates about whether to break away from Britain gave way to questions about how to separate and how to declare it. A committee was formed to draft a Declaration of Independence, and the main drafter was Thomas Jefferson, a young and intelligent lawyer who loved Enlightenment philosophy. In a small room in Philadelphia, he sat by candlelight and slowly wrote the words that would shake the world. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. When any form of government becomes oppressive, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. On July 4, 1776, the colonial delegates gathered after fierce debates and the hesitation of some who feared the consequences. The Declaration of Independence was adopted. At that moment, there were no bright fireworks, as in later Independence Day celebrations, and no live broadcasts. But those present understood that they had just crossed a line from which there was no return. They had officially declared to the world that the 13 colonies were no longer colonies. From that point onward, they were the United States of America. From one angle, it was only a sheet of paper with handwriting. From another angle, it was the birth certificate of a new country. However, signing the declaration did not stop the war. On the contrary, it made the conflict clear. This was no longer an argument between subjects and a king, but a war between two countries, one old and one new. The British Army, with its mighty fleet and seasoned professional troops, moved in to attack New York and occupy many cities. Washington's army often had to retreat and endure hunger, cold, lack of weapons, lack of warm clothing, and lack of ammunition during some winters, especially at Valley Forge. American soldiers walked barefoot on the snow, leaving bloody footprints along the marching route. Many deserted and went home in despair, but many others clenched their teeth and endured, believing in what they called freedom. During those difficult years, what kept the American Revolution standing was not only courage, but also skillful diplomacy. The leaders of the young United States understood that if they relied only on their own strength against the British Empire, their chance of victory was small. They needed allies. And in the European context of the time, there was one power very willing to weaken Britain, France. Through diplomats such as Benjamin Franklin, who was both a scientist and inventor and a subtle statesman, the Americans worked to persuade the French court to support them. The opportunity came after the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. This major victory proved that the colonial army was not the disorderly rabble many Europeans imagined, but could defeat the British under certain conditions. France began to believe that the American Revolution had hope and decided to openly ally with the United States, supplying money, weapons, warships, and even troops. French participation deeply changed the course of the war, because Britain now had to divide its forces to face not only the colonies, but also its longtime rival in Europe. Meanwhile, the war in North America gradually shifted southward. The British hoped that in the southern colonies, where the economy depended heavily on plantations and slavery, many people would remain loyal to Britain rather than support independence. At first, they won several victories, but gradually, American generals such as Nathaniel Greene adopted flexible tactics, avoiding direct clashes when at a disadvantage, splitting forces, striking quickly, and withdrawing fast to wear down the enemy. Battles like these took place across the Carolinas and Georgia, like needles pricking continuously into the body of the British Army, tiring and draining it. As a result, by the early 1780s, a large British force under General Cornwallis had been driven into a difficult position at Yorktown, Virginia, a small coastal town. From the land, American troops under Washington and their French allies moved in to encircle them. From the sea, the French fleet cut off British supplies and escape routes. After a period of siege and continuous bombardment, Cornwallis was forced to surrender in 1781. The fall of Yorktown was not technically the last battle, but it was the decisive punch that broke British will. In London, people began to understand that continuing the war in America would only exhaust the empire, while the chance to regain full control over the colonies grew ever more distant. Peace negotiations were opened. In a meeting room in Paris, representatives of the young United States sat opposite representatives of one of the most powerful empires in the world. Finally, in 1783, the two sides signed the Treaty of Paris. In this treaty, Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States of America, defined the new borders, and ended the war. On paper, it was a few lines and some seals. In reality, it was the affirmation that farmers, merchants, lawyers, and craftsmen in 13 small and scattered colonies had truly stepped out of the shadow of an empire to become citizens of an independent nation. Looking back over the entire journey from the early 17th century to 1783, we can see that the story of the founding of the United States is not just a chain of battles, but a long evolution of consciousness. In the beginning, Europeans came mainly to survive and make a living. They accepted many impositions as long as they had land to farm and better chances than in their old homeland. But over successive generations, children born and raised in the New World began to feel that they were not simply Englishmen living abroad, but people who belonged to a new land, with its own climate, lifestyle, communities, and experiences. They became used to managing their own villages and towns, electing local councils, and openly debating public issues, things that were not always available in the mother country. When tax laws and punitive measures from London hit them, the colonists were not only angry about money, but also about feeling disrespected. They did not accept being treated like children needing a distant father to lecture them. They wanted to be treated as grown citizens with the right to take part in deciding their own fate. That is why slogans like "No taxation without representation" became symbols. The American Revolution was therefore not simply an uprising against taxes. It was the affirmation of a new principle for that era. That political power must come from the consent of the governed, not from bloodlines, thrones, or guns. Of course, even within this revolution, there were many contradictions and limits. Not everyone enjoyed the promises of equality. Black slavery continued, and Native Americans were pushed back. But even with all those contradictions, the fact that a group of poor colonies scattered along the Atlantic coast dared to declare independence and forced an empire to recognize them remains one of the most remarkable stories of early modern history. After 1783, the United States truly began to face new questions. How could they build a stable government without recreating tyranny? How could they reconcile the interests of large and small states, of North and South, of the rich and the poor? Those questions would lead America to new turning points, new arguments, and even new wars. But every later chapter of that story began with the first phase. From 13 poor colonies full of forests and farms in the New World to a nation that dared to stand tall and state its name to the world after a war that lasted nearly 8 years. The American Revolution, the war that gave birth to the United States.